If oil writes the real headline, then the ceasefire was already dead. Let me start with the number, because sometimes one number tells you more truth than 50 speeches. Oil hit $101 a barrel and jumped 11% in a day. That is the headline, not the carefully phrased statement, not the smiling press quote, not the promise that things are under control. If the market believed the ceasefire was real, if the market believed the shipping lanes were secure, if the market believed Washington was still dictating the terms, you would not get that number. You get that number when traders look at the Strait of Hormuz and say, the risk is real. You get that number when the market hears Iran talking about a new phase in the management of Hormuz and decides that is not empty theater. You get that number when the battlefield stops being a military map and becomes an economic system problem. So before we talk about Congress, before we talk about Trump, before we talk about the spin machine, I want you to hold that number in your mind. $101, up 11%. Because that number tells you the ceasefire may still exist in official language, but it is already losing in reality. Now let's build. The rest of the picture, according to the transcript you gave me, Iran's new supreme leader breaks his silence and says there will be a new phase in the management of the Strait of Hormuz. Then he follows it with a much broader message. Distrust the false promises, demand compensation, stand with Iran, rise. Understand who won this battlefield. Again, whatever side you take, the strategic meaning is obvious. Tehran is not speaking like a side that thinks it was cornered. Tehran is speaking like a side that thinks it discovered leverage. And in this war, leverage is not just missiles. Leverage is the map. Leverage is the shipping lane. Leverage is the insurance cost. Leverage is what happens when every country that depends on Gulf energy has to ask itself a brutal question. Do we still pass because Washington says we can, or do we pass because Tehran allows it? That is the kind of question that changes the hierarchy of a region. And once that question becomes real, power starts shifting before any final treaty is signed. Now look at the other side of the story. Inside Washington, Democrats attempt to introduce a war powers resolution. This is not some side issue. This is the constitutional pressure point. They are trying to say, stop. Congress has authority here. This war cannot just expand on executive impulse. And what happens? The gavel comes down. Fast, hard debate, closed before it starts. That image is devastating, because if your war is lawful, controlled, and strategic, why are you afraid of the vote? Why are you afraid of the argument? Why does the chamber have to be shut down the moment someone tries to impose oversight? That scene tells me something very important. The political class in Washington understands this war is becoming more dangerous faster than its public story can keep up. So we have two images moving at the same time. In Washington, a government choking off oversight. In the Gulf, a choke point becoming more politically and economically weaponized. That is not stability. That is the anatomy of a system losing coherence. Then we move to the so-called 10-point framework described in the source material. American withdrawal from regional bases, compensation, recognition of Iran's continued uranium enrichment, control over Hormuz, charges on passing ships, removal of sanctions, recognition of Iran's role across the region. Whether every point is ultimately implemented is not even the first question here. The first question is simpler and more devastating. Did the world hear that Washington accepted terms it cannot now politically defend? Because if the answer is yes, then the damage begins before enforcement. It begins in perception, and perception matters because allies and markets move on perceived power long before historians settle the final record. That is why one of the most important details in the transcript is not even a White House quote. It is the claim that countries like France and others are speaking directly to Iran instead of just following Washington into the strait. Think about that. If America has to pressure allies to send ships, while those same allies quietly build bilateral channels to Tehran, that means they are already hedging against American unreliability. That is how influence erodes in the real world. Not with a dramatic surrender ceremony, with one practical decision after another. One country cuts its own deal. One insurer adjusts pricing. One ship reroutes. One buyer recalculates. One ally stops waiting for Washington. And then suddenly everybody says the same thing. Something changed. The market is the fastest to admit it. That is why oil matters so much in this story. Oil is not only about gasoline, it is about the broad cost structure of modern life. The file says gas prices are already moving higher, with warnings that some places could see $6 or $7 gasoline. It says fertilizer costs are surging. It says farmers are feeling it. It says housing becomes even harder as inflation pressure and interest rate pressure stack up. So now the war is no longer a foreign policy argument. It is a domestic bill. And that is where wars sold through strength often begin to fail. Not when the first strike happens, when the cost migrates from the map to the kitchen table. The source material is very sharp on this point. It moves from oil to GDP revisions, 1.4, then 0.7, then 0.5. And right next to those revisions, officials are still promising 4 or 5% growth. They are still saying the economy will be booming. They are still calling the crisis temporary. This is where the whole performance starts to look fraudulent. Because a real strategy confronts costs, a fake strategy narrates over them. And once a government starts narrating over obvious costs, people stop listening with trust and start listening with suspicion. That is fatal in war, because trust is what keeps the public from panicking, keeps allies aligned, and keeps markets from front-running political collapse. Lose trust. And every part of the system moves first to protect itself. That is exactly what the transcript suggests is already happening. Congressional oversight is suppressed. Allies hedge. Iran talks like it owns the next move. Oil markets, price and disruption, domestic economic pain spreads outward through gas, fertilizer, inflation, and housing. And the White House still talks as if this is just a messaging challenge. This is not a messaging challenge. This is a leverage crisis. And the reason it is so dangerous is that leverage crises are self-reinforcing. The more Washington looks politically divided, the more Tehran looks strategically patient. The more Tehran looks patient, the more markets believe the pressure can last. The more markets believe the pressure can last, the more domestic pain rises. The more domestic pain rises, the weaker Washington's political position becomes. Then the same government that rushed into the war has even less room to climb out of it. That is the loop. And once you are inside that loop, bold talk becomes almost meaningless unless you can materially reverse the leverage. Right now, based on the material in your file, Washington has not done that. It has not restored trust. It has not reopened the debate, honestly. It has not calmed the oil market. It has not stopped allies from hedging. It has not prevented Tehran from speaking as if time is on its side. And that is why I think the most revealing line in this whole story is not even the harshest one. It is the softest one. We have to be a little more low-key. That is what you say when events are outrunning the script. That is what you say when the show of force did not deliver clean control. That is what you say when you need the crisis to shrink faster than your leverage is shrinking. But that is not what the market heard. The market heard Hormuz, the market heard uncertainty, the market heard cost, and markets are often crueler than governments because they do not care what you meant. They only care what the structure now allows. If the structure now allows Iran to squeeze shipping, force diplomatic hedging, and translate battlefield disruption into economic pain, then the ceasefire is not a peace process. It is a pause on paper inside a larger system that is still breaking. And if Congress cannot even force a serious debate while that system is breaking, then the danger is not just that the war expands. The danger is that America keeps discovering one price jump at a time that it no longer controls the consequences of the escalation it set in motion.